It's okay. It's 1:30. I don't, Brian, do you want to say anything since this was your idea?
Okay. Rand, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah, sure. I'll start off with it. Rand and I, as we have many discussions, and I had the opportunity to read Rand's book that he has, and I would strongly encourage you if you haven't had the opportunity to do so. And one of the things that became quite apparent to myself, even after doing this job for many years, there are a number of things that we certainly will miss as educators, because it's quite frankly an area that we're not trained in when it comes to trauma and recognizing certain aspects of it. And Rand, the purpose of our discussion today is for Rand to help share some of his wisdom and knowledge and insight, so that we can better pick up on those cues for when we need to be perhaps facilitating students to seek that guidance and support. I think we've had some scenarios with students, when they've come to us here at Lobolis, and I know some students have come out and said, they've been under the influence of drugs for quite a number of years, and as a staff, we may not see it because we don't quite frankly know what to be looking for. And this is, we're blessed to have Rand to share his knowledge and insight with us. So that's really what this is about today. So Rand, I'm going to pass the torch back to you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And this isn't specifically how to tell if a kid's stoned in class. Um, uh, it's more a look at at what's going on with kids. And I think, I do think we miss a lot. We get tied up with, uh, meeting curricular requirements, which is absolutely something that we have to do. I think we also have to remember that we're also teaching kids. And I've said for years, if you can connect with somebody, if you can catch them by the heart, you can teach them whatever you want. So I don't know if Mr. Sean is here or not, but if he hasn't used this joke for Friday Funnies, he probably will. So the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop, and the fellow that's working there says, can I help you? And the Dalai Lama says, can you make me one with everything? Okay, so we'll start with that. And now my screen won't change. Okay, now if you've ever listened to me in the theater, I always am talking about these questions. Is it true? Is it really true? Because we lie to ourselves. We create a narrative in our own head, and it's actually our left side of our brain that does this. It creates a narrative that helps us uh, uh, accept, deal with, manage whatever's going on in our world. And that story that we create in our head creates our feelings and our actions. And I've talked to lots and lots of kids at Loboldis who have felt that they're not really seen, that they're there, but they aren't really seen as a person because there just seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. And I think, culturally, it's a school that has always, like I was laughing the other day because I showed somebody a picture of me teaching at Campion High School in 1972. I had long hair and was dressed quite a bit different than I dress now. Well, actually, not a lot. But even back then, there was this really high academic expectation of kids that went to Campion and Marion, and it got passed on to Loboldis. And and so because it's in the South End, and because generally, not always, and the demographic there has changed a little bit with different cultures coming into our building. But generally, there's a belief that these kids are coming from, for the most part, pretty good situations. And um, if we think that, then often we will miss something. And the fourth question is, how would I feel or act if I thought differently? So I'm always encouraging people to check their thinking. So there's basically four things that affect us. And when I say us, I also mean the kids that we're working with. Uh, uh, we can lose sense of self, and sometimes when we're in a situation where we're not seen, we will start to lose sense of self. We can start to lose connection if we feel that we don't fit in or we're not part of something. We start to feel disconnected, and when we are experiencing too many things that are uncomfortable, we tend to start to switch off our capacity to feel. And our capacity to feel isn't just switched off about negative things, it's switched off about everything. So we can very quickly stop caring about stuff that we uh, normally would care about, and that we should care about. And it's not that we don't want to, it's that we can't. And we get caught up in that sort of feeling that everything is stressful. So there's been a huge amount of research on what's called adverse childhood experiences over the last 15 years or so. And initially what was being looked at were extreme cases, like physical abuse. There's 10 things uh, that are used for the assessment of adverse childhood experience. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, uh, physical neglect, emotional neglect, household with mental illness issue, house where the police are showing up, dealing with something, domestic violence, substance abuse, or divorce. And when we first started to look at this, we tended to look at the more extreme cases. The research that was done was done typically in uh, communities that had a lot of disadvantages. But as the research around this has evolved, we started to realize that every one of these things is a spectrum. So the physical abuse is in a spectrum, which ranges from extreme physical abuse back down to, uh, you know, getting pushed because you're not cooperating. And uh, last week at Laboldus, I talked to 3 kids who had been pushed hard into a wall by a parent, emotional abuse. And again, that's a spectrum. So, and that spectrum ranges from, you're a horrible child. I don't know why we even had you, or you're an accident, to you need to do better. 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 I've worked with lots of kids whose main trauma issue was hypercritical parents, parents who were always, no matter what they did, was never quite enough. And from the parents' perspective, they are trying to help their kid. Their intention is to motivate. But at some point, that motivation becomes counterproductive. And sexual abuse, again, ranges from inappropriate touching to, to rape. And again, I've talked to multiple kids at Laboldus who have experienced that. Sometimes it was by a sibling, sometimes it was by a parent. Often it was by a babysitter or somebody's friend. And age ranges from 4 or 5, which was a babysitter. This one girl that I'd worked with there last year a lot, was a babysitter, uh, to getting drunk at a party when they're teenagers and being sexually assaulted there. But it also sexual assault in our heads. Sometimes it's a family member commenting on our physicality, on our development. The neglect also is in a spectrum. So physical neglect, when we think about it, classically, it's no food and nobody's, helping you go to bed, or there's no bed to go to. But and same thing with emotional, like being, constantly berated, called names, those kinds of things. But lately, kids are starting to identify parent absence, and not physical absence, but emotional absence, because the parents are so caught up with whatever they're doing that they no longer have time to pay attention to their kids. Same thing with emotional neglect. I've had 2 or 3 kids recently say, I can't get my mom to pay attention to me because she's on her phone all the time. Which is, it doesn't, we don't think of those kinds of things as neglect. But again, is what we are thinking true? Is it really true? The perception of the person who's receiving that has to be considered as well. And then the household dysfunction, mental illness, which ranges, the classic things are bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Those are the kinds of things that when they started doing this research, were the things that were popping up. But it also includes depression, anxiety, adult ADD, ADHD. Those kinds of things start to impact children as they're developing. Domestic violence, ranges from frying pans flying across the house to fist fights to arguing. And I again have talked to kids at Leboldus who, have witnessed extreme violence in their households. Uh, they've been attacked by a parent. They've watched parents attack each other, and those kinds of things are traumatic. But so is listening to parents argue all the time. Or fight all the time. Lots of kids, and then the divorce is the other one. Lots of kids are relieved when their parents get divorced because fighting stops. But then that, it creates a new set of issues. Police coming to your house. We've over the years we've had parents arrested for a variety of things, and that's really upsetting for kids, and it's embarrassing. And I've dealt with lots and lots and lots of families from Leboldus who one or two parents often have substance problems. And again, that's something that we tend to look at as a black or white issue, but it isn't. It's a spectrum. And there are a lot of high functioning people with addictive disorders that are parenting our kids. And, dad comes home or mom comes home from work and has 3 or 4 glasses of wine, or dad comes home from work and has 3 or 4 beer. And what happens is that emotionally disconnects the parent, because alcohol is an emotional anesthetic. And so they lose parent involvement, they lose parent participation. And again, I've had lots of kids with parents with extreme addictive disorders. And, one of them was VP at a bank, another one was a very successful business person. But, I think, we often miss those kinds of things. And certainly, like I tend to hear worst case scenarios about stuff all the time. But when I look back at my teaching career, and like this is my 50th year, so I've got a few years under my belt. One of the things that I made sure I did was try and understand what was going on in kids' worlds, and that made a lot of difference to them. And I like Lisa, I had the beautiful advantage of teaching art for most of my career, which is where like most of the time you're talking to kids about what's going on in their worlds. And that's a little bit more difficult in a math class or a chemistry class, but we can connect. So what happens when kids are experiencing 4 or more of these things, and even one starts to matter, but the big switch is 4 or more, sort of prior to when they are 16. This starts to cause some significant cognitive changes in the kids. Essentially, what it does is it triggers their fight, flight, or hide stress response system, and they are anxious all the time. Now, we've seen a huge increase in anxiety over the last 5 or 6 years. Part of that is because we're getting better at recognizing it, but also it's becoming much more obvious. And if we look at some of the statistics around what happens because of those adverse childhood experiences, 4 more of those situations create a 60% increased risk of developing an addictive disorder. So, along with an increase in anxiety, we're seeing an increase in substance use. 95% of people who develop addictive disorders in adulthood start using a substance before they're 17. Huge increase in depression as a result of those adverse childhood experiences. 60 or close to 60% for females and closer to 40% for males. Nobody's really sure why there's a difference, other than men seem to hide it better. I don't think there's actually that much difference, but they tend to have a more difficult time disclosing it. And significant impact in school performance. So absenteeism goes up as those ACE scores go up. Attention problems, ADD and ADHD go up as those ACE scores go up. And academic performance tends to go down as those ACE scores go up. So, you know, one of the things that I do in most of the schools that I work at is I'll get a list of all kids that have missed like 8 classes or 10 classes, and I'll start talking to them and finding out, okay, well, what's happening? And sometimes they were legitimately sick, but more often than not, it's an issue. You know, things are crazy at home, uh, or you know, there's no connection at home, and so they are unhappy. And so brain-wise, what's going on with this is as kids experience these adverse childhood experiences, that starts to disrupt their neurodevelopment. Their brains are not developing as they should. Now that's a very treatable thing. And once we identify it, we can start to work with it. And it's been really interesting. I've been teaching this stuff to teenagers in larger groups for 3 or 4 years now. And I regularly get kids coming up to me afterwards and saying, like, thank you for explaining that. Now I know why I'm anxious. Now I know where it's coming from. And fundamentally, we can't fix something if we don't know where it's coming from. And kids will go to doctors and get diagnosed with some anxiety, but most of the time there isn't that discussion about where it's coming from. It's here, like, take this or do this, and you try and treat something, but you don't really know what the cause is. Once you recognize the cause, then it becomes much more manageable to treat. And so that disrupted neurodevelopment, when particularly when we're not properly emotionally nurtured, we don't learn how to connect with people. We have anxiety, we have some depression just from the situation that we're in, and then we get popped into school environments, and we don't really know how to form connections, and then we start to do things to try and get attention, because we hurt. Remember those 4 things that hurt. If we hurt, we will try and find a way to stop that hurt. And some kids find healthy ways to stop, and other kids find less than healthy ways to stop. But I think it's the less than healthy ways that we need to pay attention to. So ADD and ADHD are often very symptomatic of disrupted neurodevelopment. And actually, I go off on tangents occasionally. There's a lot of really interesting evidence that ADD and ADHD can develop prenatally if the mom's stressed. And I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. But then those at-risk behaviors start to create problems. They get into trouble in school, and they don't want to go to school because they don't want to get in trouble, and then they get in trouble. It's just spirals off. So the anxiety stress cortisol loop is really interesting, and it's important to understand. And that was one of the reasons that Robin and I and Stephanie kind of worked on developing that mindfulness program, and tried to get people engaged in using it in the classroom, because it starts to bring anxiety down. And if you bring anxiety down, brains work better. So as soon as somebody's anxious, their brain starts releasing cortisol. And if you've grown up in a situation, like I mentioned, with those adverse childhood experiences, your stress response system is constantly activated. It doesn't get turned off. And unfortunately, most people are so used to that they don't realize that that's what's going on. And then one of the things that's happened recently, and I think the pandemic has part to do with it. People's stress levels were already up high, from those adverse childhood experience pieces, and then you add on this health crisis, and it pushed a lot of people over an edge. And so the anxiety issues became much more obvious. But when you're anxious, your brain releases cortisol, and cortisol restructures your brain function. It pulls energy away from your neocortex, which is your thinking, problem solving part of your brain, and focuses it in on fight, flight, or hide. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart speeds up, your galvanic skin response speeds up, your nutrition system is slowed down because your body starts to store fat. One of the issues with our stress response system is it's about 4 million years old. And so one of the primary stressors that we evolved through was a food shortage. And if that's a stress, then your body's going to do things to try and keep you alive. And one of the things it does is store fat. And which then starts to create its own stress, because oh my God, I've got a tummy. And if you don't know where this anxiety is rooted, it's really, really difficult to treat. So you try exercising, you do all sorts of things, but that cortisol is interfering with the capacity to really manage what you're trying to change. So I mean, that's one of the physical pieces of it. But because it alters our neocortex, we have a much more difficult time paying attention and staying focused. Uh, if you're being chased by a bear, the only thing you have to pay attention to is running faster than the bear, hiding from the bear, getting a big enough stick to scare the bear away. You don't have to do any other kind of problem solving, because if the bear gets you, there won't be any problems to solve. So our capacity to pay attention to other things and stay focused on other things is really limited. Learning and recall, it takes energy away from flow into the hippocampus, which is our main memory center. And so our short-term memory isn't working properly. Even our vocabulary is reduced. So, we've got a group of kids, it's certainly not all kids, but lots of kids are suffering stress coming into our building. And that stress is often really historical with them. Like, it goes back a long way, and they don't really recognize that they have it. But everything that we're trying to do with them is difficult for them. Not because we're not brilliant teachers, but because their brains are having a really hard time doing what we expect them to do. Chronic stress, which is stress that's happening all the time, disrupts sleep, causes emotional distress, and we need emotional comfort to be able to engage with things. And poor eating habits, and it also interferes with nutritional effectiveness. So one of the things that we were trying to do by introducing this mindfulness program is giving people a little short opportunity, as regularly as manageable as possible, to learn how to start to self-regulate. Because as soon as you engage in a mindfulness practice, that cortisol response is either stopped or reduced, and then your brain starts to work better. And so, I mean, initially I was pushing to do that at the start of every class for 2 or 3 minutes. And some people are doing it, but if you haven't, I'd really encourage you to consider it. So all of these things, vaping, gaming, sex, drugs, alcohol, social media, are built into this whole stress response system. So when we feel stressed, we look for some kind of escape from that stress. And if we use any of these things, and there's also, cutting and would run out of room if I tried to list everything. When we use any of those things, we get a perception of relaxation. And perceptions are not necessarily real. And typically what we're doing is we're teaching our brain that it doesn't have to do anything. And that weakens our stress response system. And the consequence of that is that more and more things seem stressful. And so remember, when you're stressed, it's harder to pay attention. It's harder to concentrate. It's harder to focus. When you're stressed from those adverse childhood experience issues, you've got attendance problems, you've got performance problems at school, which then start to create their own stress. And so one of the things that we do when we're stressed is run away. And it's either physically running away, it's not showing up, or jumping into one of these things. And that allows us to escape, but it also prevents us from paying attention to what we're paying attention to. So we just get caught in this little loop where we're going round and round and round all the time. So when we're thinking negatively, when we're feeling stressed, this is a rotational scan that shows the areas of the brain that become less active. Any areas that holds or that look dark in this type of scan are areas that aren't working well. And if our brain's not working well, we aren't working well. If we practice some mindfulness and some gratitude, those areas that weren't working well start to become more active, and that's really totally related to reducing the impact of cortisol. So again, when we're stressed, the reactive part of our brain is using most of the energy that we should be using to think, figure out, problem solve those kinds of issues. And so, when you see kids having a hard time concentrating, when you see kids constantly fidgeting and fooling around, when you see them going to sleep, it's really important to start to think about, not they need to smarten up, but what's the matter? What's bringing on this reactive behavior? Because that's what it is. And if you're not, and not everybody's comfortable having those kinds of conversations with kids, but you've got a really good student support team there. Rhonda and Denise are both really competent counselors. If you don't want to introduce that discussion with the kid, let them know or let me know. Unfortunately, we're not having as many Fridays as I would like, but I'm more than happy to get a referral from a teacher and say, hey, can you check in with so-and-so because they're sleeping all the time, or they're really distracted, or they, whatever. Robin's there if you need some help working on some of that mindfulness stuff. So when kids are stressed, they get stuck down here. They get stuck in this. If you remember your Psych 101 class, this is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. So they'll get stuck either in physiological needs, if home's crazy enough that there's physical neglect. That's all they're worried about, like getting enough food. If home doesn't feel safe, if there's lots of fighting and arguing, that's going to be using up a big part of their energy, trying to protect themselves from that. Even when they're at school, they're going to be worried about what's going to happen when they go home. And if these needs aren't being filled properly, then the rest of this, we really lose access to that. we can't really connect properly. We can't really develop self-esteem if we're constantly worried about safety, or emotional safety, physical safety. Is my mom going to be okay? You know, I've had lots of kids whose parent, you know, they've had a suicidal parent, uh, and so, you know, they're worried about that. And if they're if their trauma, you know, is affecting them emotionally, that's going to block them from being able to do what we're trying to do with them at school, which is educate them enough so that they start to get some power back. Uh, so just do this for a second or two with me. Well, actually, a minute or two. So if you're doing that, and if you're paying attention to it, you are activating your parasympathetic nervous system, which turns off that cortisol response. And turning off that cortisol response is what we're trying to do when we introduce this more sort of global mindfulness program to be used as much as possible. Because what that does for the student is it allows them to re-engage their brain. One of the this was a riffle kid, but I've had similar issues, similar discussions at Lebolda's. This is a kid whose dad has a alcohol problem and is verbally abusive most of the time. The dad's been kicked out of the house, and but the kid still is affected by the trauma that he saw while the dad was there. And I've been pushing him for a couple of months to get going on some meditation things. And 2 weeks ago, uh, I saw him and I said, "Did you try the meditation stuff?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "That's the first time that I can remember that I felt normal." He said, "All of that other stuff stopped." And then he started to cry. And he said, I realized that I can stop what's been going on in my head. And, you know, I've seen him since, and he's still doing it. And he's progressively starting to be able to let go of some of the things that he's been hanging on to. And, you know, and we think that, you know, uh, maybe this is just sort of a like a catchy thing, or a, a, a fad, but this is fundamentally what we need to do to really learn how to control and manage what's going on with the with our brains. So we have huge neuroplastic capacity. So everything that we are, we have learned to be. There's a little bit of genetics involved in this, but 90% of what's going on with humans is learned behavior. And, you know, we wire and fire patterns that teach us how to work through things. I'm just checking the time. Uh, I get talking, I can go on for hours. Nobody wants that. I know, I understand. It's Friday. Uh, we wire and fire patterns, and we get stuck in those patterns. But one of the absolute beautiful things about our brains is that we can rewire them, we can change it, and we have a really strong negativity bias. You know, we tend to look for bad things, and you know, when we lived in caves, that was pretty important because bad things then could kill us. For the most part, now bad things can't, but our brain hasn't changed. That fight, flight, or hide response mechanism is exactly the same as it was 10,000 generations ago. Uh, And so we have to be aware of that, and we have to learn to uh, 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 pay attention to that, but also to learn how to override it. And meditation stuff is really useful for that. And if we focus our attention on what we are trying to change, then we can start to fix it. And this is like a brain exercise thing. Uh, and so the more we do it, the better chance we have of developing some new patterns that work better for us. Um, and this little guy doing his little workout in a couple of minute mindfulness exercise as often as possible is incredibly healing. And there's mindfulness is one solution, meditation's another one, exercise is another one. Uh, Exercise is uh, incredibly valuable for dealing with both depression and anxiety. And so when a kid's in a phys ed class, often that spins out to doing better in other classes because they've got a natural outlet for that. Uh, but you don't have to have a gym membership and have $200 worth of Lululemon, whatever you're wearing, to go to the gym, uh, and go for a walk every day for 30 minutes, 5 times a week is as effective as antidepressant medication. But again, it's got to be something that you practice it, and routine is important. So, doing things at the same time every day is really valuable. And often when I'm working with kids, one of the things that we do is make sure that they've got a routine. Are you going to bed at the same time, eating at the same time, getting up at the same time? And gratitude, creativity, nutrition, and community are important. But if you're stuck in your stress response system all the time, uh, the nutrition and community are really difficult because our bodies aren't working properly. And because we get stuck in not feeling safe, creating community is difficult. So Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, is one of my favorite writers. He's spent time in concentration camp in the Second World War. And one of the things that he discovered there is that even in horrible situations, we can still find good. And he was out on a march from one place to another, and everybody was starving and freezing. And he saw a bird and heard the bird. And that made him realize that he could still feel joy. And it's like that boy that I was talking about. Once he recognized that he could still feel okay, that cracked open the possibility that things could get better. And you can all read, but the between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So those 4 questions that I'm always yapping about. Oh, look, they're right there. Um, Allow us to start to moderate our response. Uh, we need to pay attention to what we're thinking, and we need to help kids pay attention to what they're thinking. And we need to either help them or direct them to some help to uh, get somebody to give them what they haven't been able to get often at home. So Brian very kindly mentioned this. I've been working on this for quite a while, actually, and the COVID lockdown actually gave me time to finish it. But it gets into a lot more sort of deeper understanding of what I've been talking about here for 45 minutes. So that's all. Those are all the ways you can get a hold of me. My website, which is, there it is live. There's 200 or 300 videos in there. There's self-care stuff. In the update section, this is a similar thing to what I just talked about today. You can download that. this, if you want a bunch of information on marijuana, that's a PowerPoint presentation with a bunch of backup info that you can get. I send out a thought for the day with a photo on it that I take, and a quote by somebody smarter than me, and an interesting piece of music. If you know, if you're looking for an uplift or something positive to think about. So that's essentially, I'm 3 minutes. I got 3 minutes left. So I'll stop that. Anybody want to ask me anything, talk about anything? There's Mackenzie. She's my practicum student. I invited her. She has to survive hanging around with me every day. So, give her a round of applause. Does anybody have a question or a comment or anything? You're all muted, I think. So if you want to say something, you'll have to unmute yourself. If not,
Rand, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Sort of my headset died, so I'm just doing it the old traditional way through the computer. So first of all, thanks for taking the time to do this, with us today. You talked about gratitude, and we certainly want to express our appreciation to you for sharing, your knowledge and your insight with us, for sure. There's a few slides that went by in your presentation today, and the one that kind of stands out for me is a practicing gratitude versus stress slide. It provides a lot of context for us, and we understand the mindfulness practices we've been doing this past month, and it's, as you said, trying to really reduce that or turn off the cortisol response, and what we're trying to do. I think another thing that you mentioned to me as well, and something we always got to remind ourselves, folks, as we work with kids every day, that even with these horrible situations that we do find our kids in, that there's still some good that can be found with that too. So it's all about our mindset, and this has been a good reminder for us today, in that regard. So, Rand, on behalf of all of our staff, thanks for taking the time today. I certainly do appreciate it.
Okay, I recorded this, so I'll stick it on YouTube, and I'll send you the link, Brian. And then if anybody fell asleep during this, or just logged in and then went and vacuumed their house or whatever they're doing and still wants to watch it, they can access it that way. So thank you.
Okay.
I will.
Right. Thanks again, Rand.
See you in 2 weeks, because there's no school next Friday evening.
Okay.
Take care.